In Numbers chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, we were told that on the 20th day of the second month of the second year, the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, and the people of Israel moved out in stages. Then the cloud stopped over the Paran desert. Through those two verses, we see that Israel had become a national body at Mount Horev and moved out and travelled northward to the southern border of the land of Canaan, where they camped in preparation to enter into that land that was to be called Eretz-Yisra'el. Today's parashah opens with Yhvh giving Moshe instructions yet again, and this time he says, "Send the men on your behalf to reconnoiter the land of Canaan, which I will be giving to the people of Israel. From each ancestral tribe, send someone who is a leader of that tribe, capable of displacing the Canaanite, who were direct descendants of Noah's third son Ham, along with other people groups from the descendants of Shem." In all, there were 10 tribes, or 10 nations, residing in Eretz-Yisra'el when God had promised the land to Abraham 430 years earlier. God made a covenant promising Abraham's descendants that in the 4th generation they would return, take possession of the land. All that is recorded in Genesis chapter 15. Now, in the opening words of Numbers chapter 13, Yhvh is telling Moshe to send the men to reconnoiter the land of Canaan. That was a wise military move, because no army ever goes into battle without first gaining intelligence about the strength and the location of their enemy. So Yhvh was instructing Moshe to do just that in verses 17 through 20. It was very similar to what Yehoshua did when nearly 40 years later, when the second generation of Israel were camped on the plains of Moab. He sent 2 spies across the Yarden to investigate the strength and the opposition in Jericho. However, in today's parashah, Moshe is sending 12 spies into the Negev, up through the hill country towards Hebron, the place first mentioned in Genesis chapter 23 verse 2. That was where Abraham bought a field with a burial cave in which he laid his dearest departed Sarah. It had also become the family tomb for the 3 patriarchs and their wives. It marked the ancestral homeland for the family of Israel. It had been legally purchased, even though the whole land had been promised to him by God. That stands in stark contrast with the modern world view that the land belongs to the Palestinians. After 40 days in the land, the spies returned with 2 good reports, but regrettably 10 negative ones. Verses 27-29 say, "We entered the land where you sent us, and indeed it's flowing with milk and honey, and here is the fruit. However, the people living there are fierce, and the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the Anakim and the Hittite, the Yhvh, the Amori in the land of the hills, and the Canaanite living near the sea and along the side of the Yarden River." The 2 people groups that stand out are the Anakim and Amalek. They were the ones that frightened the 10 spies into giving such bad reports. So let's consider firstly the Amalekim, who are more commonly known in English as Amalekites. They are the national group that came into being through Esau's firstborn son, Eliphaz. Esau, of course, was the twin brother of Jacob, who was the 3rd patriarch. So we see the 2 people groups, Israel and Amalek, were distant cousins. But while passing through the region of Rephidim, on their way between Egypt and Mount Horev, the people of Israel were attacked by the Amalekim. As Exodus 17:8 through 13 says, "They fought all day while Moshe held his arms up high. When he let his arms down, the Amalekites prevailed. Finally, towards sunset, Yhvh defeated Amalek. However, the battle cost many lives amongst the Israelites when Moshe lowered his arms. As that battle had occurred little over one year earlier, it was still very fresh in their minds. So they did not have confidence that Israel could conquer the land from the Amalekites. It would be easier to admit defeat before getting into battle yet again. But they were forgetting one important feature. Yhvh had promised that he would go ahead of them and clear the way for them to move in and remove the enemy. The second people group the spies encountered were the Anakim, who were formidable in appearance, and the 10 dissenting spies were in total terror of these people. Bamidbar 13:33 says, "We saw the Nephilim, the descendants of Anak. To ourselves we looked like grasshoppers by comparison, and we looked that way to them too." Comparing them with the giants from Genesis chapter 6 verse 4, from the period before the flood of Noah. Now, there has been much discussion in both Christian and Jewish circles as to how the Anakim could have been part of this world, because they were part of the pre-flood period when the Nephilim were still in existence. How could they have survived the flood? The answer lies in the parentage of the Nephilim. Scripture says that they were the offspring of the union between the celestial sons of God and human daughters of men. So how could they survive through the flood? I prefer to refer to them as celestial rather than heavenly. When we're speaking about those errant sons of God as being heavenly, it conjures up in the mind of many people that the idea of them being holy, righteous like God himself. So it's better to refer to them as celestial. The reality is that they were the total opposite from holy. Even though they were from heaven, they were the fallen sons of God, who had been spurred on by Satan, the adversary, to procreate with the daughters of men. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that the Nephilim, along with the rest of the corrupted creation, were wiped out in the flood, as we're told in Genesis chapter 7. However, as the Nephilim were only partly human, their fathers being celestial, it seems logical that the celestial part of their being would have remained through the flood. But any spirit being here on earth requires a body. So having lost their human form in the flood, their celestial form had to seek out new human beings in which to dwell. Yeshua also alludes to this in the actions of such unclean spirits, where he says, when an unclean spirit comes out of a person, it travels through a dry country seeking rest and does not find it. Then it says to itself, I will return to the house I left. When it arrives, it finds the house standing empty, swept clean and put in order. Then it goes in, takes with it 7 other spirits, more evil than itself, and they come and live there. So in the end, the person is worse off than he was before. The second example is the madman Yeshua encountered in the graveyards on the eastern side of Lake Kinneret. The man was possessed by a legion of demons, which Yeshua drove out into the pigs. Those 2 examples show how Yeshua dealt with demonic spirits. Therefore, it makes perfect sense that as the Nephilim were physically destroyed at the time of the flood, they survived as demon spirits, which later sought, of course, human hosts. Just as Genesis 6:4 says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bore children to them. These were the ancient heroes, men of renown. So the Anakim that the spies saw during their reconnoiter in the land were most likely the group of people who were being dwelt in by the spirits of the Nephilim. It is no wonder that the spies felt like grasshoppers in their midst. One interesting point worth considering is that the Anakim were present in Eretz-Yisra'el, that is the land of promise, when the 12 spies had entered. Yet in the time of Abraham, Yitzhak and Yaakov, when they were living in the land, there was no mention of the Anakim. Now it seems perfectly reasonable that during the years while Yaakov was down in Egypt until Israel returned, the adversary had actually planted the Anakim in Canaan with the express purpose of frightening the Israelite spies. Such an action would certainly have engendered fear into the men of Israel, who were not prepared for battle, because those who were of fighting age had been born into slavery in Egypt. They had never known war. By sending the spies into the land and having told them through Moshe that he, Yhvh, was going ahead of them to clear away all the nations there, they needed to reflect on the blessings that Yhvh had bestowed upon them on the way between Egypt and Mount Horev. Upon their return to the camp, Caleb and Yehoshua together stood up and demanded that the people be silent and listen to their report. Caleb says, "We ought to go up immediately and take possession of it. There is no question that we can conquer it." But the opposition was overwhelming. The 10 bad reports found favour with the majority of the people. So as we read in chapter 14, Moshe and Aaron fell on their faces before the whole of Israel. The result was that Yhvh responded with great anger towards them, saying to Moshe, "How much longer is this people going to treat me with contempt? How much longer are they not going to trust me, especially considering all the signs that I have performed among them? I am going to strike them with sickness, destroy them, and make from you, Moshe, a nation greater and stronger than they are." Now Moshe's response was one of pleading, where in verse 19 he says directly to Yhvh, "Please forgive the offence of this people, according to the greatness of your grace. So just as you have borne this people out of Egypt until now." In response, Yhvh answered, "None of those who treated me with such contempt will see the land. But my servant Caleb, because he had a different spirit, him I will bring into the land, and the land will belong to his descendants. Your carcasses will fall in the desert." So who was this Caleb? The list of men who went out to reconnoiter the land, Caleb was the one chosen to represent the tribe of Yehudah. So, would we be correct in assuming that he was a descendant of Yaakov through the 4th son, Yehudah? No, he was a Gentile. Doubtless, he was part of the mixed multitude who came up out of Egypt, along with Yaakov and the family. In Yehoshua chapter 14 verse 6, we are told Caleb was the son of Yhvh, a Kenizi. So, who were the Kenizi? In answering that question, we need to turn right back to Bereshit, Genesis chapter 15, verses 18 and 19, where God made his covenantal promise with Abraham, saying, "I have given this land to your descendants, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, the territory of the Keni, the Kenizi, the Kadmoni, the Hitti, the Perizi, the Rephaim, the Amori, the Canaani, the Gehazi, and the Yhvh." 10 tribes. We see from these verses that the promised land, including the territory all the way from the Wadi of Egypt, all the way to the great river Euphrates, was the territory which covers all the landmass which we know today as Arabia. That is, of course, apart from one small portion that Yhvh promised to be the inheritance of Israel, the descendants of Abraham through the line of Yitzhak and Yaakov. Caleb, however, was a descendant of the Kenizi, and so was descended from one of the 3 tribes that resided in the greater part of that promised land during the time of Abraham. But by the time the spies entered to reconnoiter Eretz-Yisra'el, the first 3 tribes are no longer mentioned among the tribes that were to be removed. Instead, they've been replaced by the Amalekim and the Anakim. But it may well have been that the 3 tribes were still there, but east of the Jordan River, so they did not need to be removed. Even to this day, there is no real consensus about where the Kenizi people came from or where they lived. It is very likely that they were descendants through the line of Shem, the firstborn son of Noah, just like Israel. However, what we are seeing here is this man, Caleb, turned his back on his own family of origin in favour of the life of the people of Israel. That feature is akin to Ruth in the book of the same name, when she gave up living with the Moabites and said, "Your people will be my people." Caleb was a true son of Israel, not by birth, but by trust in Yhvh and all that Yhvh had promised, and we'll consider shortly in the book of Hebrews. Later, in Yhvh chapter 14, the narrative tells how the promise of Yhvh that Yhvh made to Caleb, following his good report, was finally fulfilled. His trust in Yhvh ensured that he was well rewarded, even though it took another 45 years before it was realized. So what about Yhvh, who also gave a good report? We know from earlier parashot that Yhvh had already been selected by Moshe to be his assistant. Starting with the battle that he won against the Amalek and his army on the journey to Mount Horev, he doubtless strengthened the relationship between himself and Moshe, because we see at the end of the spy list in Bamidbar, in the words of chapter 13 verse 16, "These are the names of the men Moshe sent to reconnoiter the land, and Moshe gave Hosea the son of Nun the name Yhvh." From that time onward, Yhvh was constantly a faithful servant of Yhvh and a friend of Moshe. That brings us to our readings in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, where Sha'ul, or Paul, is speaking to his Jewish brothers in Rome, who were for the first time being exposed to the real awareness of Yeshua. He was admonishing them that they were not to fall back into the same lack of trust that their forefathers had shown towards Yhvh, particularly at the time in Kadesh Barnea, when the forefathers listened to the words of those 10 dissenting spies. Any who were going to put their trust in Yeshua as their long-awaited Mashiach or Messiah had to remain steadfast in their newly found knowledge and trust of Yeshua. Sha'ul's audience we see from the closing words of Acts chapter 28 were his fellow Jews living in the city of Rome. When Sha'ul arrived in chains, they wanted to know why he'd been arrested and why he was awaiting trial by the emperor. His response in Acts 28, 23, 24 says, "From morning until evening he explained the matters to them, giving a thorough witness about the kingdom of God and making both the Torah of Moshe and the prophets the ways to persuade them about Yeshua. Some were convinced by what he said, while others refused to believe." So against that background, Sha'ul began his powerful discourse in Hebrews chapter 3 verse 1 by saying, "Therefore, brothers, whom God has set apart, who share in the call from heaven, think carefully about Yeshua, whom we acknowledge, publicly as God's emissary and his Kohen Gadol. It is not until we understand who the audience was that we really appreciate the depth of the words of Sha'ul. In verses 12 through 19 he continued, "Watch out, brothers, so that there will not be anyone among you with an evil heart, lacking trust, which could lead you to apostatize from the living God. Instead, keep exhorting each other every day as long as it is called today, so that none of you will become hard-hearted by the deceit of sin. For we become sharers in the Mashiach, provided we hold firmly to the conviction we began with right through until the goal is reached." Then he draws attention to the bitter quarrel that impacted that first generation of Israel as they stood on the borders of Eretz-Yisra'el, only to be told that all those 20 years and older would die in the wilderness. They would never enter the land. Sha'ul continues in chapter 3, verse 16, 17, 19. "The people who, after they'd heard the spies' reports, quarreled bitterly. All those whom Moshe had brought out of Egypt, and all of whom God was disgusted for 40 years. Yes, they fell dead in the wilderness. And to them he, Yeshua, or Yahweh, swore that they would not enter into his rest. They were unable to enter because of their lack of trust." Sha'ul continues in Hebrews 4, verse 8, saying, "For if Yehoshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day." So what was the day of rest that Yehoshua could have given to Israel? It was the rest from the need to conquer the surrounding enemies. But even by the time Yehoshua died at the ripe old age of 110, rest from their enemies was still not occurring. Why? Because they had not vanquished the 7 nations as they had been instructed. They did not adequately trust what Yahweh had said. Sha'ul was speaking to his own generation there in the middle of the 1st century CE, over 1,500 years after Yehoshua had led that generation into Eretz-Yisra'el. So the Talmudim of the 1st century yet could still enter into God's rest. Then if it follows that if they in the 1st century could enter into that rest, so also we can enter into that rest in the 21st century. But what is the rest that Sha'ul was speaking about? Clearly it was not a rest from physical war. Here Sha'ul is giving us the answer in chapter 4, verse 6 and 7. Since it still remains for some to enter into God's rest, because those who've received the good news earlier did not enter. Yahweh has fixed a certain day, called today, and he says through David, so long ago, today if you hear God's voice, don't harden your hearts. Then in verses 9 through 11, there still remains a Shabbat keeping for God's people. For the one who has entered into God's rest has rested from his own works, as God did from his. Therefore, let us do our best to enter into that rest, so that no one falls short because of the same kind of disobedience that the forefathers experienced. Because with God, we are responsible for our own actions. As Bamidbar 15:30-31 shows, there are severe consequences for intentional wrongdoing. As it says, any individual who does something wrong intentionally, whether a citizen or a foreigner, he is blaspheming Yahweh. That person will be cut off from his people because he has had contempt for the word of Yahweh and has disobeyed his command. That person will be cut off completely. His offense will remain with him. So to be cut off, what does it mean to be cut off from his people? It means exactly what it says. It is not just for a short period of time. Rather, it may well be for eternity. Therefore, it is totally wrong for any believer in Yeshua to hold to the doctrine, once saved, always saved. Clearly, there are profound consequences if a person intentionally shows contempt towards the God of the universe. Therefore, what we see from the whole event in the Paran Desert is just how angry Yhvh could become because of the contempt of that generation. We also see how history has always constantly repeated itself when people are willingly reject the promises made by Yhvh, the God of Israel. Just as Yhvh got angry with that first generation in the wilderness, also Yeshua, on more than one occasion, got angry with the people of his generation. Then Sha'ul shows in Hebrews that even his Jewish brothers in Rome still had to learn from the mistakes of their forefathers. They were soon to face the destruction of the Second Temple, and they were being given one last chance to turn from their contempt by the promises that were laid before them through belief in the death and resurrection of Yeshua. Just as Moshe's generation wandered in the wilderness for the next 38 years following the rejection of Yhvh, so also the people of Yehudah carried the Torah outside of Eretz-Yisra'el. Following the destruction of the Second Temple, they wandered into the wilderness of the Hellenistic nations for a period that lasted for 38 Yhovels, or 1900 years, before the sovereignty was returned to Yehudah through the Six-Day War of 1967. I believe those two periods, both ancient and modern, are much more than just coincidence. God's plan is always accurate, but Israel still has to learn many lessons from both occasions. They will never win the battle under their own strength, but only through trust in Yhvh. Even today, since 7th October 2023, Israel has been again faced with the apparent insurmountable problem in the form of Hamas. So will they realize that only Yhvh, their God, can deliver Gaza back into their hands and bring about a true rest from war? Will Israel truly know the gravity of their mistakes in turning from Torah and the prophets and the teachings of Yeshua? But in the not too distant future, the words of Zechariah will finally come to fruition, where Yhvh says in chapter 12, verses 9 and 10, "When that day comes, I will seek to destroy all the nations attacking Jerusalem, and I will pour out on the house of David and on those living in Jerusalem a spirit of grace and prayer, and they will look to me, the one whom they pierced. They will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son." So in conclusion, from what we have considered this morning, that the first generation of Israel, who were led out of Egypt because of their own actions, did not enter the land that they were promised, nor did they enter into God's rest. They did not trust the promises of Yhvh. Instead, they expressed contempt. Only 2 men of that whole generation, over 20 years old, entered the land: Yehoshua, a direct descendant of Yaakov, and Caleb, a Gentile from one of the nations which Yhvh was yet to destroy. Those 2 men alone were spared the death in the wilderness, simply because of their trust in Yhvh. Just 1 Jew and 1 Gentile out of that whole generation. In the same manner, Sha'ul warned his generation that Yeshua's Talmudim that they had to continue trusting in Yeshua. Even today, we also must continue to have that same trust, or we too will be subject to God's wrath when Yeshua returns. If we seek to go our own way or follow the doctrines of men which are not based in Scripture, we risk the possibility of being cut off completely from the divine presence in the Olam Haba, the age to come. Shabbat Shalom.